Okay, so the appeal rights are another tool that are designed to provide those elements that I mentioned earlier, involvement and transparency and accountability. And the kinds of things, these are usually site-specific approvals, and they're always site-specific approvals that are being appealed. And the examples are most frequently issues that relate to the Ministry of Environment and Climate Change, and water taking permits are high on that list. Also air approvals and waste approvals, and a few sewage approvals. So the third-party appeal, it's not an automatic right to appeal. You need to be given permission to appeal first, and that's the legal term is you need to be granted leave to appeal. So that's a hurdle. And it's a two-part test. You first need to be able to demonstrate that no reasonable person would have made that decision. And that's often called the insane director requirement. And the other is that you have to be able to demonstrate that the decision could result in significant environmental harm. So that is a significant hurdle, but people do achieve it, and about 1 in 5 of the cases do succeed to convince the Environmental Review Tribunal that this is the case. Now, I should, by way of explanation, these decisions are made not by us because we're not a quasi-judicial tribunal. We have a watchdog oversight role, but these decisions are made by the Environmental Review Tribunal. And so when you make this application, you have to point out that you have an interest, and that often means that you either live right there or that you've already commented on this. Those, both of those are typically, reasons to be considered having an interest. You need to explain what parts of the instrument you would like to appeal, and the grounds that you give, and why you think this would result in significant harm, and a statement of all the facts and evidence. So you do need to do your homework. And you need to submit all this to the Environmental Review Tribunal, and that's their website. And a copy also needs to come to our office. And you must do this within 15 calendar days of the decision having been posted on the Environmental Registry. And the tribunal is very strict on that interpretation, so don't be late. And that's why it's important to monitor the registry, and that's why the app may help some people, right? Because you only have 15 days. And those who do overcome those hurdles, they have the opportunity then to present their full arguments. And it doesn't usually end up in a hearing. I think what happens most often really is that when people are given leave to appeal, then the ministry and the proponent will say, well, why don't you come in for a meeting, and let's talk. Because then you have leverage, right? You have that legal power. And so there is this mediation opportunity that you've created for yourself. And so often that means that you can add conditions to the approval. And so it is a legal tool. And you do need to pay attention when you're doing it. We've had well over 150 requests, and in an average year we get about 6 of these requests. And we summarize all of them, and so that if you want to see what's come before, you can go to our website and get case studies of how this plays out in real life. I think I've just said all that. So let me give you an example here. So this is a permit to take water, in this instance to a hydropower operator. And of course they don't take water in a consumptive way, but they do change the flow of water, the flow rate of water, and the dynamics of the water body. So there was a leave to appeal requested, and the grounds included that the river was at risk, and that the proponent hadn't done enough studies, and that more work needed to be done to assess the impact, and that also the dam would change the water temperature below the dam, and that would affect fish. So that was another concern. And in this instance, and also that they were being given. They reached a settlement, and so the permit to take water was granted for 5 years, not 10. And there were clauses included, conditions about how the dam would operate, and how the records would be kept, and that the run of the river should be restored as soon as possible. So that gives you a sort of a pretty good example of some of the kinds of outcomes that people can manage when the leave to appeal process works for them. Again, our guidebooks online will help you understand the details. And every Environmental Review Tribunal's website is also quite helpful. Our office is really a tool that was created by the Environmental Bill of Rights, that oversight role. And much of what we do really is we research and we issue annual reports on all manner of issues. And so it's a great way to get a sense of what's going on in Ontario, what the emerging environmental issues are, what has happened with some of the decisions in recent years, how well the registry is working. We cover all that. And it's all searchable. In 2008, our mandate was expanded so that we now also comment every year or review the province's progress on greenhouse gas emissions and on the energy conservation, so those twin mandates. So that's made our life even more interesting. And to toot our own horn a little bit, I mean, we try to keep our information very current. Obviously, it's Ontario focused, and we try to be fair, independent, and we aim for plain language on issues that are often quite technical. And we don't always hit that mark, but that's what we're aiming for. So now I'm going to really zoom through a few of the findings, and just really a few of the findings of our latest annual report, which was called Small Things Matter. And because we have so many ministries that we oversee and so many issues, it means that we really can only do snapshots of various things. So we include snapshots on biodiversity, on species at risk, but the only ones that I really want to cover this evening are the ones that deal with water. But first, I want to get back to the issue of the registry and the fact that its IT platform is dated. So we really made that point strong and clear this year and said that an overhaul is quite overdue. We know that more and more people, certainly people in their 20s, use almost exclusively their mobile devices, and the environmental registry is definitely not mobile friendly. And I know I've met university students who, when we talk about the registry, they say, yeah, I was on that, but I realized it was a bogus site. So they could not believe they were on a government site, really. That's, a government site wouldn't look that way. Well, it does. Okay. So it needs an overhaul, and it's dated, but use it anyway in the meantime. So let's move to water. So the issue that really garnered the most attention, of course, in the media was the issue of water taking and water charges. This is not something that we had said for the first time. We had been saying this for a number of years in past reports. And indeed, the Auditor General in 2014 made this an issue. And the Drummond Commission in 2012 had made water charges and the whole idea of user pay a key element that the government should work on. And so it was just kind of interesting to see that it struck a nerve this time. But the point was really that really only a very small percentage of water takers with permits are paying a fee at all, and that there's many sectors that are paying nothing at all. The agricultural sector, the sand and gravel industry, golf courses, municipalities, to name a few, right, are paying nothing for the water that they take. And that's a concern, because water quantity is being managed by the province, and it does take money to manage it. So right now, the province really takes in only about 1.2% of the costs that it actually spends on water quantity management. And so that's a concern, really. It's a concern as well, because those who pay nothing for the water are not being, there's no incentive, there's no incentive for them to conserve. So the real question, or one big question, I mean a lot of questions are raised by this, but one big question is whether $16 million is enough. I mean, that's a question that is raised in my mind. And I sort of want to unpack that just a little bit now. In 2005, the Ministry of Environment and Climate Change updated the way it looked at its water taking. It had a new water taking a manual for permits to take water, and in that it sort of enshrined or laid out its core principles for managing quantity. It wanted to incorporate risk management. It wanted to use an ecosystem approach, consider cumulative impacts, and promote public and agency involvement. All very good, good principles. Absolutely, go for it. And I think that I'll leave it to you, really, to see whether in the work that in the examples that follow, whether they're able to carry that all out. In our most recent report, we point out a number of tools that we think are really important for managing water quantity, and those are the use of water budgets, the attention to, they call them environmental flow requirements. Ecosystem needs would be another way to look at it, and the paying attention to how much water the permitted users are actually taking, because they have that data now. And so it would be really good if the ministry was doing all these things as it evaluates proposals to take water. So let's look at water budgets for a minute, and you very likely know that water budgets have been required, sort of a required element under the Clean Water Act in 2006. And so every source protection area, and there are about 38 of them, I think exactly 38 of them in the province, they've had to create these source protection plans and also water budgets. And the Grand River watershed happens to be one, and they happen to have done a very detailed and thorough job. A great deal of attention has gone into these water budgets, and a great deal of money too, I have to say. The Auditor General noted that in the last decade, the province has spent about $240 million on the source protection planning process, mainly on the planning side of things. And that has paid for this very sophisticated expertise, the consultants who have put together these water budgets. And the water budgets are complex, lengthy documents. In the case of the Grand River, you've got the Integrated Water Budget Report, and depending on the level of risk that is determined in sub-watersheds, they have to go to a more sophisticated level. They, for example, need to do a Tier 2 water quantity stress assessment report. Each one of these documents runs to several hundred pages. I mean, there's a water budget document for the region of York that runs to 900 pages. So these are very elaborate technical reports. Then there are these peer review summary reports. A lot of money, a lot of expertise, and a lot of important knowledge that you, in many ways, are the beneficiaries of. And the kinds of things that should be considered in a water budget include the issue of base flow. And a really important indicator of watershed health, of course, is long-term base flow. And base flow is essentially the flow that returns or that feeds a stream or a river under fine weather. So I'm not a hydrogeologist, but that is kind of a plain language description of what base flow is. And base flow then depends on recharge areas. And so where this is all going is that when you develop, when you add subdivisions to a landscape, when you add new neighborhoods, when you pave over landscapes, the recharge no longer happens, and you get decreased base flow. And that really needs to be factored into this whole issue of water taking, which I think is often forgotten. You know, we often imagine that water taking happens because people put a straw in the ground and suck. What really happens is that the water doesn't get into the aquifers to begin with, right? And so in this instance, what you're seeing here, this is not in this watershed, this is in the Lake Simcoe area, but you're seeing two rivers, the Beaver River over 40 years, that has had a base flow that has, gone up and down, but has remained more or less constant over 40 years. And then you have the East Holland River, which has been affected by the urban growth not only of Aurora, but also Newmarket. And I see here that it says Newmarket, but we all know that means Newmarket. And that's the fault of the Lake Simcoe Region Conservation Authority. But here's the point, right? Is that in a sophisticated evaluation of a watershed's health, you want to be able to think about the recharge areas and the base flow, and that is not so much a function of what is being taken out at any given permit. By any given permit, but by how much we've paved over. Naturally, you also do want to consider the cumulative impact of water taking permits, and this is the ministry's sort of speckled account of the water taking permits in southern Ontario. This is a 2012, and so you see that you live in an area where there are a lot of permits to take water.
Is that municipalities or private enterprises?
That would include all. That would include all. Yeah. So water budgets are supposed to account for all water in and out of watershed, and you've got really good documents now that are out there. The ones I've showed you, they're all online, and there's a great deal more. But what doesn't happen is, they're potentially a very powerful tool, but what we're not seeing any strong evidence, any evidence really, that the ministry is using those water budgets yet in its evaluation of permits. They say they are, but the Auditor General evaluated this in 2014 as well, and also said they saw no evidence that the ministry had yet integrated this new information into its formal process for evaluating water taking permits. It does require expertise to interpret. You're working with very sophisticated models, and in effect you need to make those models sing, and so you need the expertise in-house on staff at the ministry, and that's I think one of those issues that we really need to ask about. And I also think we need plain language summaries for these very lengthy, complex documents. And I think that's not too much to ask. I mean, you can't dumb down hydrogeology too much. It is complicated. And if you're interested, you have to be able to do the homework, and you have to be able to keep up. But, and I would say the conservation authorities, which I really have not mentioned yet, they do a very good job of trying to to explain concepts to the public and keeping things transparent. But they are commenting agencies at best on these permits. They don't make the decisions. So water budgets really are a tool that I think are not yet being used well enough, and we've gone and we've spent all that great money, and we should be using them. We also need to be looking at environmental flow requirements. So what does the ecosystem need? And the ecosystem doesn't complain, it doesn't submit a complaint to the Ministry of Environment, and there often isn't anybody checking either. And what the ecosystem needs, it is to some extent still a developing field of science. It is also not easy, because a stream or a river is a very dynamic thing. It needs a different thing every day almost. I mean, there are times of year when it would naturally flood, when there would be scouring of the stream bed. There are periods of low flow. Really, I mean, if you imagine a stream that is the same all the time, what you have is a canal, right? And that's not a stream, right? So it is a complicated thing, but ecosystem needs need to be factored in, and that's why our office is. That's really what we're looking for. We're speaking for the fish, and that also is not happening yet. I mean, to some extent, the ministry does put certain conditions into certain permits. It will say, for example, that it shall take no more than 10% of stream flow at a time. But the ministry has also issued guidance documents for Lake Simcoe, acknowledging that that's an enormously oversimplified perspective. You can't just say, well, no more than 10%. It depends on the location, it depends on the time, it depends on the species that you're wanting to manage for. So one thing that troubled me was that the ministry a few years ago told us that the ministry does not generally require water takers to install devices or otherwise alter water sources to allow measurement of the flows or water levels. So they do from time to time, but it's not a routine requirement. And the ministry also does not monitor. There really is little monitoring. Stream gauges are few and far between. The Conservation Authority staff will tell you that. And they're expensive to maintain. Expensive. Again, this speaks to the issue of us valuing the resource and charging a fair price for it. So we know there's too little monitoring of stream flows. We've also been told that the ministry inspects about 4% of water taking permits on an average year for overall compliance, and that's a low inspection rate. And again, this idea of 10% threshold, this idea that you don't take more than 10% of a stream, that is too simplistic. And if you want to read more about this, we wrote about this a few years ago in our 11-12 annual report, and the piece was called Leave Something for the Fish. Here's an example. This is an example of where ecosystem needs are not being looked at. Whiteman's Creek, I've never been there myself, but I understand that it's flows into the Grand near Paris. So this is not a great picture, but it was taken by a biologist, and what you're seeing there are a very large number of trout stressed by water conditions, low water conditions, low oxygen, and they are at a tributary inflow where they're needing the cooler water, and so the needs of these trout are not being addressed, and what the Conservation Authority there has observed is that the water level's too low to sustain fish. On average, they're observing that every third year on this creek. And there are other creeks in that area that are seeing similar things. So this is an example of where the ecosystem needs are not really being respected. And this is an area where there are very strong agricultural draws for water. And of course, when does agriculture need its water? It needs it in the dry season when everybody else needs it, when the fish need it as well. And so those are the tensions that are out there on the landscape. I mentioned the need for the ministry to look at the data on actual water takings. Since 2005, they set out a new requirement saying that water takers have to now begin, or will be beginning, to say how much water they're actually taking. So not just what's permitted, but what they actually take. And it's been quite a few years for the ministry to do the outreach and the awareness raising, but they say that 90% of water takers are now reporting that information. And what we would like to know is how they're using that data, and can't they make that public? And we've heard anecdotally that the actual water taken is only about 30% or 35% of what is being permitted. But that's an average, and it would be enormously valuable to know what that means on any sub-watershed basis. So, in response to our advice or concerns on that, the ministry has said this year, just this summer, they said, well, we'll consider improving access to that data and showing how we're using the data. So, that's a step forward, and we will monitor that. We will hope that the ministry actually lets the public see that. So often data are collected, but it's a matter of crunching it, right? Again, that's expensive. You need to bring in a consultant very frequently, and it's a time-consuming and demanding exercise to lay this kind of information out for the public to understand. But that's, that interpretation and use of the data is what makes it useful for us. And so we have to insist on that. So again, these are the tools: water budgets, ecosystem needs, data, the actual data that they've been collecting since 2008. We would like to see the ministry applying those when it evaluates water takings. Here's another angle, and this has to do with the registry. What we found this year when we evaluated how the registry shows the public the sort of universe of water takings, we've observed this in the past, but we just kind of dug into it a little deeper this year. The reality is that through the registry, you only get to see about a quarter of the water taking permits that are issued. And there's whole important categories that don't show up on the registry at all. And those categories are municipal water takings and agricultural water takings and any water takings that are less than 365 days. So dewatering, dewatering for construction, those kinds of things you don't see. And so that decision to screen those from public scrutiny, that was made in 1994 when the Environmental Bill of Rights was first established, and it's an outdated concept, and especially because the ministry in 2005 said we want to do this on a risk-based basis, and they since 2005 have been laying out the risk levels for every water taking permit. We asked them, well, how many of your municipal permits do you consider high risk? Well, most of them. And so, and this means risk to the environment and to other users. So, and when they say risk, they mean it's an important impact on that local watershed. And so, it sort of stands to reason that if they are, if they are high or moderate risk, then those are the kinds of things that the public should have a right to see on the registry. And so we would like to see that that decision or that exemption overturned.